Have you ever sat down and started contemplating your existence? And I don't mean that in like a kind of shallow way, but I'm talking about actual life. Like the contemplations of what is the meaning behind everything around us. Things are so chaotic and unknowable, and there's so much out there in this world. And what is the grand meaning of it all? Well, I found a book that I think discusses these points, or at least gives you the sense of an understanding in some way, shape, or form. Sit with me here for a second, because I want to talk about the contemplations of existence. I know from personal experience that I've gone through my own existential crises in life. I've had to sit down and ask myself, why am I here? Why are we here? What is the purpose behind all of this? This chaotic world that systems are put into place and then changed and broken. I never felt like I've gotten an answer, but I have found ways to make peace with the lack of an answer. Now, you're thinking to yourself, why am I posing this question to you? I want to discuss something called The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. This book is an interesting novel. It's hardly even really a novel. It feels more like a collection, almost like a journal of personal thoughts. But it is written by Fernando Pessoa utilizing his semi-heteronym Bernardo Soares. Now, all of these words may start sounding a little crazy. Semi-heteronym, existential crisis, cynicism, and even nihilism. Before we really start unpacking these terms, I want to let you know exactly who I am. I'm Tim with No Streetlights Plus. I'm going to be your guide through this analysis. I do want to let everybody know before we get too deep into this analysis and start picking apart the philosophical aspects that make up this novel, there is going to be a pretty soft trigger warning right here, right now. The Book of Disquiet has been known as one of the saddest books ever written. With that being said, reading it can put you in a pretty depressive state. It can take away and make you start contemplating things that you probably haven't considered before, at least to the degree that this book will make you think. These contents can be pretty uncomfortable, so I do recommend you're in the proper headspace before continuing on with this video. I do also recommend sitting down and reading the book so we can all kind of come together and have this in-depth philosophical discussion about this book, understanding this is just my take on it. There are a lot of people who would probably take what I'm going to hear and agree with it to some degree, even partially or mostly. But I want to hear your thoughts on the book itself. It's a relatively large book, but I do think it would be doing yourself a disservice not experiencing this book with an open mind and a clear conscience as to what exactly is inside of it. Okay, so one of the big facts about the Book of Disquiet that gives it such this intriguing story is the way it was discovered. You see, Fernando Pessoa never intended for this book to be finished or published, or at least to the best of our understanding. Fernando Pessoa passed away in 1935, and honestly, he was pretty unknown outside of small circles of Lisbon. His death did reveal a startling secret, though. It was a literal physical trunk filled with thousands of pages of unpublished works, fragments, and notes. Among these manuscripts, the book that would later be called the Book of Disquiet was pieced together. I've stated earlier, the book is not necessarily cohesive as a novel. It was fragmented and written sporadically over decades. It was never revised or organized by Pessoa himself into a single manuscript. But this lack of structure is kind of what gives the book this raw and unfiltered quality. It really does feel like you've opened up somebody's private diary. After the discovery, it wasn't until decades later that editors started piecing it together and putting it into the version of the book that we now have. But what's interesting is this book is still debated as to whether or not this was the possible intention of the original author. Depending on the version you get or the translation, the way the book is structured could be drastically different. I did mention earlier nihilism, cynicism, and existentialism. These are terms that people like to utilize in mostly philosophical circles, but in the massively educated and connected world that we live in today, you can stumble upon these words pretty simply. Cynicism is kind of like armor. It's more so like a defense mechanism. It keeps the world at arm's length and a little bit away from you, probably because you've been let down too many times. Nihilism is kind of like cynicism, but on steroids. It goes a bit further and kind of says that everything is meaningless. There's no point to this life, and you're looking into the void. There's nothing but blackness. And then we get to existentialism, which does vary from cynicism and nihilism in the sense of how it's actually defined and utilized in the philosophical world. But existentialism more so covers how you've come to understand that the world is pointless, but it then asks the question of, what are you going to do about that? Now you're staring into the void and the void stares back. Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet really doesn't align with any three of these, but instead it kind of hopscotches between them. You'll find texts and passages that are nihilistic and full of cynicism, but then you'll also find these nice passages that dive into existentialism and truly contemplating through Soares's voice of what it means to be alive and what the purpose of all of this really is. The book really doesn't comfort you, but in a way that's kind of what makes the book so fascinating. It's raw and unfiltered and kind of gives you this sense of what it means to be alive, and it completely embodies that. I've talked a lot about this introduction, The Book of Disquiet, and I do highly recommend you read it. But I want to take a second here before diving into my thoughts on it. I want to ask you, where do you stand on these philosophical concepts? Do you see life as inherently meaningless, or do you find the kind of comfort in creating your own purpose? Please let me know in the comments below, because this is a conversation that I think a lot of us should be having. I do want to talk about the Book of Disquiet in depth, but in order for us to fully understand why this book is the way that it is, we should really talk about the man who wrote it, or in this sense, the man who created the man who wrote it. As we sit and think about authors, some of the most famous scholars throughout the history of the world, you'll notice that there are authors that people generally know a lot about, scholars and, intellects throughout history. Fernando Pessoa's name doesn't usually fall in these lists. In fact, I would say Fernando Pessoa's name sticks primarily in these niche corners of philosophical studies. Now, that's all to say, Fernando Pessoa was a very enigmatic writer. His life wasn't extraordinary in any kind of conventional sense. He wasn't a war hero, he didn't lead anybody in politics or political movements. And honestly, he wasn't even really celebrated that much during his life. Kind of gives you the sense of Edgar Allan Poe, except he never expanded to the size of Edgar Allan Poe's works post-mortem. However, what's so amazing about Fernando Pessoa is truthfully his inner world, his mind. And that's where all the magic that Fernando Pessoa brought to this existence and his life occurred. Pessoa was born June 13th, 1888, in Lisbon, Portugal. He was born in a middle-class family, but his life wasn't very easy in the beginning. At 5 years old, his father passed away from tuberculosis, and sadly, unfortunately, shortly after, his younger brother also passed away. Shortly after these losses, the Pessoa family was left in financial instability. In 1896, his mother remarried a Portuguese consul, and they ended up moving to Durban, South Africa. This was actually where Pessoa was introduced to British culture and education, shaping him in ways that would define his literary voice. He attended an English school where he excelled in literature and language and was fluent in English by his teenage years. He constantly devoured works by Shakespeare, Milton, and the aforementioned Poe. Influences that would echo throughout the writings that we would eventually get. Though he was successful academically, Pessoa was a relatively solitary figure. He seemed to enjoy living at an arm's length away from everybody, kind of cycling back to that cynicism and nihilism earlier. Pessoa did describe himself as living within himself, and this theme would dominate his literary writings. As a child, it seems that he even existed in a world of his own, retreating into books and his imagination. In 1905, Pessoa returned to Lisbon, where he briefly attended university and then dropped out. Formal education really didn't seem to be Pessoa's interest, and he decided to turn to self-studying instead, where he would dive into philosophy, mysticism, and European literature, a place that I think he felt the most comfortable. Now, I've mentioned the term a couple times at this point, but a heteronym. Pessoa's heteronyms were slightly different than this, though. They were much more than just pen names, but they were fully realized characters. They had their own backstories and backgrounds and childhoods and philosophical views, and even their writing styles varied between them. I think that's incredibly fascinating because, if I wrote 10 essays, after reading a couple of them, I'm going to start seeing patterns. But Pessoa was able to change this internal voice for each of his characters. So we've covered a lot about Fernando Pessoa here. He died in 1935 at the age of 47. He succumbed to liver failure after spending a life of heavy drinking. And as mentioned above, he was a relatively obscure figure. He had a life that was very unextraordinary, and he spent most of that time writing. But the works that would later be discovered and eventually published were something that's well worth diving into. In fact, I've even wondered, how would Fernando Pessoa feel seeing his books being published and read these days, and some people on the internet are making videos talking about it? I don't know if he would be upset, but I think it's very interesting to think about that.
Because, if I was a ghost, I would not pass because I would be screaming and I would feel so embarrassed if someone's just reading my diary. Like in my funeral, she left this diary. Let's all read her thoughts. No!
No! No, God! God, no! No!
In my coffin.
Yeah, that's actually probably what would happen.
Exactly.
So he'd be like, nope, nope,
I wonder if his pieces were more personal to him and he did not want to share. Not just my curiosity.
The book is a really heavy book, but there's some passages in there where he's describing people walking down the side of the street. And I wonder if he wrote something in there and was like, as I saw them, I thought, wow, what a useless existence. But in reality, they're walking by and he's like, hey, great to see you. You're looking great.
Oh no.
This monster of a shell of a human that once was a person. Talking about it does feel like I am talking about reading someone's diary. It's fragmented and debated as to whether or not it's even in the proper form that it should be, or the way it was written. And honestly, I'm not going to be a person who could tell you what's the best translation or what's the best published version. I think it's interesting to just embrace the story as it is. If you find yourself an older copy or a newer copy and they differ drastically, that is, hey, it's an experience, and that's kind of what you're paying for. The book is very fascinating because there's no plot, it doesn't have a linear narrative, and truthfully, there's no resolution, but instead it's almost like opening up a paper mirror. It reflects the quiet disquiet that honestly most of us feel but don't really put into words. So who is Bernardo Soares? Fernando Pessoa had based Soares off of himself and described him even as a mutilation of his own personality. What's really interesting and honestly the heart of the book is Soares' inclusion as the quote-unquote protagonist in this story. He's very passive. He doesn't have a character growth. He doesn't seek change or any adventure. He chooses to withdraw from life and instead observe it all from a distance. This is where we cycle back to those philosophical themes we talked about earlier with cynicism, nihilism, and existentialism. Soares seems to embody a lot of these concepts and overlaps them during his writings and throughout his life. The detachment allows him to feel like he's analyzing existence with nothing but brutal honesty, and it almost leaves him in this cycle of despair and introspection. He's not only the observer, but he's also the observed. He's caught in a paradox of longing for meaning while doubting its existence. I want to make sure that I put a couple quotes from the book in this analysis so you can kind of get a feel for particular emotions that I felt when I was reading the book. There was one quote that stood out to me. I'm no one. I'm just someone who feels. And to me, this line feels like it's encapsulating identity. A man who defines himself not by action or achievement, but by his ability to feel deeply and reflect on those feelings. It's a very powerful way to talk about introspection, especially in a sense where it feels almost depressive. The book does have a rich tapestry of themes and philosophical explorations. Soares reflects on everything from the monotony of daily life to the nature of dreams, often weaving these observations in a poetic prose. Soares' life is marked by solitude, both physical and emotional. He writes, "Each of us is a closed world, a single individual who no one truly understands." The isolation that comes through in that line is not just a condition, but defining characteristics of his existence. He feels disconnected from everybody, unable to bridge the gap between the inner world that he experiences and the external reality that he meanders through. Again, talking about Pessoa and Soares and their similarities, it really does feel like these themes resonate through Pessoa's life itself, not just in the character he created. Pessoa, being a solitary figure, spent much of his time writing. And throughout the Book of Disquiet, that's what Soares discusses, finding solace in his imagination and creating worlds within themselves to compensate for the lack of connection in the real one. This book is really a lot to take in.
Yeah, I'm just imagine I can visualize him literally just sitting there watching people walk by.
Yeah, I wonder what that feels like to have such a massive mind palace, but feel like you're living in a cardboard box. Retreating into himself is where he felt freedom. I don't know.
So many people watch.
Yeah.
I mean, I am a person who we sit down and we people watch.
We people watch.
So I don't think the way he thinks.
No, he watches. The way it's described in the book is he would literally watch people walk down the alleyway and contemplate how they managed to get through their life. That person probably woke up today, had some water, ate some food, and now they're on their way to living the same day that they've lived for the past 20 years. I do think it's really awesome, though, how the book can find ways to find these meanings in mundane things. Pessoa talks about meticulous details in the world around him. Soares writes about how these tiny, insignificant, and mundane things can become philosophical meditations. He writes, "The smallness of things consoles us for the lack of greatness." And to me, I feel that this line is reflecting his tendency to find beauty in life's simplicity, even as he struggles with its larger meaning. Other passages, he talks about watching pedestrians and carriages. "I see humanity from the vantage point of a high window," which gives this detached perspective and, again, highlights the role of him being an observer, someone who views life from the sidelines and doesn't really participate in it. One thing that I thought was really fascinating about this book is the way Soares would write about the world of dreams and imaginations. They felt like this escape from the monotony of the reality he was forced to face every day. He does write, "My soul is a hidden orchestra. I know not what instruments, what fiddle strings and harps, drums and timbres, sound and clash inside me. All I hear is a symphony." I love how this discusses the chaos and richness of his inner life with a stark contrast to the outwardly mundane existence. And I even find it so fascinating inside the quote how he does state he doesn't understand what instruments they are that's playing. He just simply feels them. A lot of us can connect with that kind of discussion. A lot of us feel life going through us. But putting meaning and putting explanation to what that life is, it can really slip through our fingertips. Sometimes talking about this book can almost send me in a depressive measure. And I think this book is a incredibly uplifting view of life. Sitting there and knowing that you've never cusped that kind of mindset is almost invigorating in a sense. But it can be a very heavy discussion. I do really like the exploration of despair, though, and the human search for meaning. Soares writes, "Everything we do, everything we are, is lost in the abyss of an endless emptiness." This is a nihilistic sentiment underscoring much of his writing and it's tempered by moments of introspective beauty. This next passage, to feel today what one felt yesterday isn't to feel. It's to remember today what was felt yesterday, to be today's living corpse of what yesterday was lived and lost. Ooh, that quote is probably my favorite in this video and probably in this whole book. There was only one other quote that really stood out to me in the way that that one did, but it's like Soares is telling us to not dwell on the past, because if we do that, then we forget that we're in the present. But the way he describes it makes it sound almost like you have no choice, like you have to expand and live in the past, and you'll never be able to explore the present because you're so focused on what you felt previously. No matter what you do, life is always fleeting, and you're never going to have a grasp for that. There are senses of wonder that Soares writes about, such as this quote: "The value of things is not in the time they last, but in the intensity with which they occur." I do think that this line captures the paradox of the Book of Disquiet. It revels in life's futility while finding moments of profound meaning within it. Like I said, the way Pessoa and Soares together craft this book to almost make you find beauty in the mundane, it just strikes such a passionate chord with me. The similarities between Soares and Pessoa are undeniable. They're solitary, introspective, and deeply philosophical. Pessoa described Soares as a dreamer disconnected from action, and this is a characterization that could easily apply to himself. Through Soares, Pessoa channels his own doubts and fears and aspirations, creating a character who feels deeply personal and universally relatable. Though the lack of a conventional plot does kind of strike people as a reason to not pick up this book, I would argue that the protagonist offers a profound exploration of what it means to exist, giving this book the meaning that it needed. Soares' reflections, though deeply personal, speak to the universal truths about isolation, longing, and the search for meaning. He himself is no hero or revolutionary. He just tries to make sense of the world that often feels cold and incomprehensible.
I just bought the book.
Nice.
The hard copy.
Heck yeah. There we go. It's a good book.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. I had the audiobook though. You could have just listened to that.
No, I'm a visual reader. I need to hold the book. Mind your business.
Okay, business is being minded. I think one could talk about how the book, being such a fragmented piece, is intended to mirror the way identity is fragmented in life and nature itself. We feel like we're blurring the lines between the author and character with Pessoa and Soares, inviting the readers to question the nature of selfhood and the boundaries between reality and imagination. I've, at this point, talked a good 30-ish minutes of this book, so if you've made it this far, you're probably asking yourself the question, why does this matter? What is so important about this piece that I needed to sit down and grab a microphone, grab a camera, and record it while making my wife listen?
Because it matters.
Because it matters. It's true, though. The answer to that very question lies in the ability to articulate, but many of us rarely ever find a way to do so, these thoughts and expressions and feelings and emotions that are circling through our entire existence. And sometimes we find ourselves as a tiny, scared, insignificant human in the dark, wondering what happens to us after death. Why exactly am I here? And is success or even love something that I will ever be able to quantify and find? The Book of Disquiet really doesn't give you answers to these questions, but it helps you find the comfort knowing that you're not the only one who has those questions. This is something that digs deeply between all of us. If you're a huge fan of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you probably have heard that the secret to answer to life and everything is the number 42. There's a really fascinating breakdown as to why that actually is a pretty good answer to that question. And I don't know, maybe I'll put it in the video somewhere or put it down below, or I don't know. Editor, do something with that. Make that good.
You are the editor.
I edit these. Future me, make sure you do something good with that. It is striking and awesome in a sense. Soares writes, I don't complain about life. What bothers me is life itself. The sentiment in that quote leans heavily towards nihilism, with the idea that life lacks purpose. But again, Pessoa's work doesn't just stick to this lack of hope. It sits on this edge. Nihilism, cynicism, existentialism, and even poetic beauty. There have been historical philosophers like Viktor Frankl who offer compelling counterpoints to Pessoa's worldviews. In the book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl argues that even in the face of immense suffering, we have the power to create meaning through our choices, relationships, and contributions. No matter how dark the book seems to get, it does find beauty in life's chaos. The reflections that Soares pose, the value of things is not in the time they last, but in the intensity with which they occur. That is why there are unforgettable moments and unique people. It goes back to this feeling of fleeting life and the nature of beauty, but the fact that it's not permanent, it's present, and that's what makes it so beautiful. You can't have roses in a rose garden year-round. They have to wax and wane, bloom and die, and just to give you that time, they'll bloom again. Being that this book feels more like a mirror, it reflects our fears, our doubts, and our quiet longings. It doesn't pretend to have the answers that we seek, and truthfully, that makes it even more important and powerful than a book that would try to give you those answers. The world often demands clarity and certainty, but Pessoa reminds us that that's not always going to be a thing. Sometimes you have to live with questions. Pessoa did once write, to understand, I destroyed myself. To understand is to forget about yourself. To understand is to not know how to love. And I feel like this line encapsulates the tension at the heart of the work. The struggle to make a sense of life without losing its mystery. As one of the co-hosts on the No Streetlights podcast, I very much love talking about the human experience. And that's what really attracted me to this book to begin with. I feel like this book validates it. It's messy. It reminds us we're not alone, and our doubts and our disquiet and our moments of despair are something that we all are collectively experiencing, whether we talk about it out loud or if we internalize it like Pessoa did. I do think the book's intention of comfort is via connection. I do want to go ahead and end this exploration. I hope I've done this book justice. Granted, I'm just a YouTuber, and with that, I'm also not even college educated or philosophically inclined. I just simply find these things fascinating, and I feel like it needs to be shared and talked about. So I'm going to leave you with a question. How do you navigate your disquiet? Do you feel like you need answers, or are you okay with just finding the meaning and asking the question itself? This conversation should not stop. We should always be contemplating the philosophical existence that is life. So let's keep questioning it and show us each that we are truly, truly alive. We did it. We talked about one of the saddest books ever written. We analyzed to somewhat a high degree of what this book is about, and we've discussed some of my favorite aspects of it. The only thing left to do now is to read it and then begin asking the questions that you had. I do want to thank all of you for watching. If you've made it this far, I would like to ask you to like the video, consider subscribing, and maybe even leaving a comment. If you think these conversations and questions are worth asking, then helping this video get out in the algorithm and helping other people see it so that they can question this as well would be the best way for you to help. I do have plenty of scripts that I've started creating, so I'm hoping to get more videos like this out pretty quickly and much more frequently than we have been. If you do want to see more about the discussion of the human experience, check out the main channel, the No Streetlights podcast, where myself and co-host Aaron explore complexities and simplicities of life. So, until next time, peace!
No street lights, but we're finding our way. In the dark, but we've got something to say.